giant.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and we've got a lot to cover today. We'll start with what politicians expect of us. Actually, we're going to be contrasting their values versus our values. And I don't think it's being too harsh to say that what most politicians really want from us, you know, the citizenry, is basically a lifetime of power and checks from us with their name on them. And of course, this undue stature that they really haven't earned. And in return for that, they will tell us everything we need to do, how to live our lives, how much of our money they will need to make all of their cronies' wishes come true, etc. Oh, but we do have the added benefit that they will sometimes play along and say, you know, I really care about how much of your money I'm spending. Okay, let's dive into that a little bit further and see if that's really the case. This was a news headline that just popped up. Micron chooses Idaho for $15 billion chip fabrication plant. The investment comes following the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act. So, in other words, government had to bribe Micron in order to get them to do this. Now, look, as far as the jobs it creates and everything, that's all fine and dandy. But I want you to see what the Democratic Party in Idaho had to say. Billions of dollars in investments and thousands of high-paying jobs are being brought to Idaho thanks to the CHIPS and Science Act. That's what makes it so unbelievable that every single Idaho Republican in Congress voted against it. Well, I say kudos to those Republicans in the Idaho Republicans rather in Congress. Look, it's a wonderful thing. If Micron wants to build $1 billion, chip facility, that is absolutely wonderful. But they should be willing to do it without government subsidies. In other words, without government basically patting the sheets and saying, "Come lay down with me and let's partner up and see what we can create." Too often, it leads to barriers that inhibit entry into the market for other up-and-coming businesses. It creates crony capitalism, which is not the same thing as the true free market capitalist kind of system. So, just maybe. I mean, I understand the Democrats never met, any spending that they didn't like, but maybe in this case, Idaho's Republican congressional delegation was actually doing the right thing in the sense that, yes, this may be a good thing, and it may create a lot of jobs for Idaho, but is it the proper thing for government to do? See, that's the principle that basically any controversy that's being hashed out in state legislatures, city councils, or Congress, it's going to come down to, is this a proper function of legitimate government? And the answer for most politicians and for most statists who believe that anything not under the state's control is by definition out of control is that, well, of course it is. I mean, where would we be? Where would we have roads? No, of course not. We wouldn't have roads. We'd just build homes and businesses and neighborhoods and then just sit there looking at each other from afar with long faces. How can we ever get together? Nobody can build our roads for. We'd figure out. Come on, it's so funny that patronizing attitude of, well, you're all just children, and without government, nobody would know what to do. Now, having said that, there's also a very real problem in that Republicans often play the part of, well, we are all about fiscal responsibility, and we are all about responsible spending and shrinking the size and cost of government. So I thought you might appreciate. I believe it's the Babylon Bee here. Republicans win Emmy for acting like government spending makes them sad. As the Idaho Freedom Foundation points out, it's not even satire. There's so much truth in that. So let's take a little bit deeper dive with the help of Fred Birnbaum from the Idaho Freedom Foundation has written an excellent article on government spending far outstripping tax cuts here in Idaho. And look, you may think, well, he's being really harsh here. Governor Little has campaigned hard on how he gave so many tax cuts, but there's some rhetorical sleight of hand that takes place, and that's to be expected from politicians. Everything is going to be spun in a way that's favorable to them and, of course, paints their opponents or those who oppose their policies in the worst possible light. So what does it really mean when the governor says, well, we've given you all these tax cuts? Haven't we done you a huge favor? Well, let's tally up the numbers and see if they're being truthful. Fred says Governor Little frequently touts his tax cuts in public statements and press releases, and to be sure, he has cut taxes while growing state spending significantly. Now, if that sounds too good to be true, there are a few things to keep in mind. In his March 31st press release near the end of the 2023 session, the governor boasted, "No other state has given back more taxpayer money per capita than Idaho. We've turned back $2.7 billion in tax cuts to Idahoans in just the past 3 years." Well, that sounds like a lot of money. But Fred says the challenge in understanding this is that the governor includes a lot of one-time rebates in his total and not necessarily ongoing tax relief. So let's take a little deeper dive into those numbers. According to an analysis by LSO, income tax rate reductions from 2021 and 2022, including the extra session, will provide $575 million of ongoing income tax relief. Due to the complexity of the 2023 session, property tax cut bill, House Bill 292, Fred says it's difficult to arrive at a clean estimate of the ongoing impact. Some of the money will go directly to homeowners, while other funds are designed to take the pressure off of schools with funds to offset the need for new bonds and levies. Boy, it sure didn't stop him from campaigning on how we sure need another $500 million, though, at least in West Ada. In his press release, the governor touts the figure as $117 million in ongoing relief. So, taken together, this puts the ongoing relief at just under $700 million. Now, if we choose to include the 2018 tax relief, the total's just over $800 million of ongoing income tax and property tax relief. The governor assumed office in January 2019, so this last addition predated his administration. Now, Fred says, let's look at the spending growth over the last several years, though. Not the one-time spending for many projects touted by the governor for roads, water projects, and other infrastructure, but the ongoing spending. And the way we do this is by examining the base budget, which is the foundation for the development of the total budget. So think of it this way. Each year, the base budget is the starting point with which an agency builds its budget request for the next fiscal year. So in fiscal year 2022, the all-funds budget base was $9.27 billion. For fiscal year 24, the fiscal year that starts July 1st of this year, the base budget is $11.27 billion. You read that right. The base budget is up 21.6% or $2 billion in just 2 years, dwarfing the ongoing tax cuts. And if we go back to fiscal year 19, the base budget was $7.6 billion. So in 5 years, it's up 46.9%. That's the ongoing spending increase. Now, of course, the political class is only going to refer to this as blessings that it is showering on you, from up on high. But the bottom line is they're showering those blessings on you with your money. So, are they doing you a big favor? Well, that depends. If the mugger hands you back, $20 from your wallet after he just stole $200 from you, does that really count as, wow, what a favor, thanks, I'll go buy lunch? Now, Fred says some of you might point out that the total spending increase includes federal dollars, and we cut taxes from state funds, and that is factually correct. However, he points out Idaho has received nearly $23 billion in funds related to COVID and the public health emergency over the past few years, including money for individuals and businesses. And a significant sum of this borrowed and printed money has flowed into state coffers. In other words, general fund revenues are up by over $2 billion just from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 2022, from $4.03 billion to $6.20 billion. He says, we point this out for 2 reasons. The tax cuts Idahoans have received are smaller than they could have been if ongoing spending had been restrained. Not the one-time projects, the ongoing spending. The base budget, which is the ongoing spending, needs to be thoroughly reviewed by the legislature next session. The huge growth in Medicaid, for example, is now built into the base budget, which is why removing those who are ineligible is crucial to getting spending under control. This is one of the reasons why when I see some of the anger and the disdain and the accusations that are focused on the Idaho Freedom Foundation. How dare they look at these out-of-state interests out here just trying to impose their version of goodness on us all. And, the legacy press is probably the worst at this. And there are not a few politicians who don't appreciate it either. But this is what accountability looks like. And I'm not saying that means you should at the feet of the Idaho Freedom Foundation and worship them, but they are doing you a pretty solid favor here in crunching these numbers for you, as well as revealing the political sleight of hands or the rhetorical sleight of hands that are taking place here that would otherwise fool you into thinking that the governor just did you a solid, when in fact, they're still taking and spending more and more of your money. So consider yourself at least somewhat warned that just because a politician says, well, we just want to make these investments, what they call investments are spending. And the only possible place that government at any level can get that money is from you, from every other productive member of society. They can't create wealth, can only take it from those who create it. And sometimes it may be used something you prefer, but again, if you're smart, you're going to be asking the question, is this the proper function of government? And if it's not, why is government attempting to do this in the first place? All right, we are coming up on Pride season. Notice I didn't say Pride Month. I believe we have safely seen this expanded to it's June, all of the month of June, and pretty much every month beyond and through September. And so if you thought that things were getting pretty rainbow tinted in the last little bit, you haven't seen anything yet. I actually saw an article published in the Federalist earlier today that came right out and said, essentially what we're seeing is state-enforced acceptance of homosexuality, because most governments at every level are behind this. Wayne Hoffman, writing for the Idaho Freedom Foundation, actually does a really interesting look into how mental health experts have shifted the goalposts over time, and now things that used to be considered, actual mental disorders are treated as normal and good. And in fact, we recommend them for kids. I hope you'll go to their website, idahofreedom.org, and check out this article in its entirety. This is not going to make you hate gay people. It's not going to, make you feel bigoted against transgender people, but it will certainly show you some of the manipulation and some of the narrative enforcement that's going on with the help of groups like the American Psychological Association. Mental Health Association and media push to make sexual fetishes public, and mainstream. Here's what Wayne has to say. He says, before we get into Pride Month and in light of Target, Budweiser, North Face, and other businesses' foray into the LGBT agenda promotion, it's important to understand that some fraction of what you see identified as transgender is really a public display of sexual fetishes condoned and promoted by the psychiatric community, leftists, and the media. Now, he goes into some detail here about the problem starting with changes over many decades to the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM. Now, this is the go-to book for diagnosing mental illnesses. It's often referenced in legal documents, including Idaho law. So before I go any further, there's a book that I want to recommend if you are, curious enough to do some looking into the American Psychiatric Association, for instance. It's called A Freedom Too Far. It's written by Dr. Charles Socarides. Pretty easy to spell out his name. And unless you think, is this one of those anti-homosexual or homophobic doctors? Not at all. Dr. Socarides actually has treated thousands of patients, including those with same-sex attraction. He also has a son who is gay. And the book is essentially a couple of hundred different questions that he answers regarding the homosexual agenda. And some people say, well, there's no agenda at work here. But you have to understand, Dr. Socarides was actually at the American Psychiatric Association convention, I believe it was in 1973 or 1974. I want to say 1974, when they voted to remove homosexuality as a mental disorder. This was not done by scientific study or scientific consensus, okay? So it wasn't a matter of the science is settled. It was a matter of a political vote by a medical association. And since then, they have made a number of other changes, and this is what Wayne gets into in the next little bit of his article. He says, the original DSM was written in 1952 and had its last major revision in 2013. In that span of time, the DSM has written and rewritten to merge a variety of mental health disorders related to sexual confusion into one broad category, that being gender dysphoria, and to exclude some sexual perversions as mental health matters. That would be including, homosexuality being taken out in the early 70s. But in 2013, the DSM removed transvestic fetishism from the list of paraphilias and mental health disorders. Gender identity disorder was replaced with gender dysphoria, where a person's perceived sex does not match their body. And a new diagnostic category for non-binary gender identity was invented. Okay, again, this isn't from scientific study. This comes from political pressure and from influence groups within the APA. Trans activists lobbied to keep transvestic fetishism and autogynephilia out of the DSM-5 as mental health concerns. And a big player in that discussion was the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH, which most recently rocketed to fame for advocating gender interventions for minors. Wayne writes, being seen in public dressed as a woman, using their restrooms and locker rooms, passing as a girl or woman, even marginally, or being singled out for being cross-dressed in public, that's part of the sexual thrill for someone who is prone to this, what's it called, autogynephilia? Anyway, all of this is supposed to be captured now in popular terms like gender dysphoria, and we're supposed to go along with it, or we face being declared transphobic. See, this is part of the reason that some of these men have decided to forego changes to their bodies. In other words, it's not a matter of, well, I want to do the transition surgery, because they're not interested in surgery. They don't want to add or remove parts. They just want the excitement that comes from their presentation in public. Now, following the publication of the DSM-4, the Associated Press, the media whose style guide many news and research organizations use to conform writing, removed the word transvestite from its use of acceptable language. In 2015, the AP style book added the new entry, transgender, for describing a person whose gender identity doesn't match the sex they were assigned at birth. And by 2019, the AP style book was modified once again to recommend that pronouns should be used to match a person's requested pronouns, which is why stories involving men who identify as women refer to them as she and her, which to the autogynephilic is also sexually gratifying. Now, look, you may think, well, why does this concern any of us? Just remember, these are the news organizations. These are the media organizations that ostensibly are presenting a window on the world so that you can make better informed decisions about what you will support, what you won't support, where you'll shop, how you will live your life, the issues and events that will shape your world. If they're not dealing with you straight, in other words, if they're manipulating that information to some bizarre predetermined agenda that they bought into, they're certainly not telling you the truth, and they're certainly not reflecting reality, which makes it all the more important that you become your own fact checker. Back to Wayne's article. He says, now, obviously, look, it's more complicated than just what's in the DSM or what the AP style guide is all about. But he says it's time we get real about what's really going on. What people do in private settings is up to them. Read that line again. What people do in private settings is up to them. Every advocate of freedom would nod their head in agreement. What you do in private is none of my business. I don't want it to be my business. I won't make it my business. What you bring out into the public square, and especially what you bring in front of my kids, or you direct toward my kids, now that most certainly is my business. That's where you're going to get some pushback. That's where you're going to get people saying, hey, this transphobic stuff, or this transgender stuff is not for me. You'll call me transphobic, assuming that somehow I have this irrational fear, but it's not fair. It's just common sense. The answer is no. I will not accept that. I don't believe in whatever this made up, fantasy is, and I'm not going to be coerced into participating in it. That doesn't mean I don't love you as a person or treat you like a child of God. It just means no. You don't have any claim to be validated by people who don't see things the way that you do, or who don't share your delusion. As Wayne puts it, but the rest of us, policymakers and the public at large, need to understand that when we are exposed to Pride Month, all is not what it appears to be. It's not entirely about inclusivity. At least in part, it's about normalizing people's sexual proclivities and fetishes in public places. And again, for all the claims of, well, this is a marginalized, tiny minority of people that are just, picked on and nobody accepts them. Baloney. Ford just came out with their gay Raptor. Target is marketing LGBT merchandise to children. Budweiser or Bud Light. I don't really have to go there, do I? I mean, iconic American brands have been captured, and they've tried to force them down people's throats. You will accept this, or else. And the public has said, or else. We won't buy your stuff. Budweiser is imploding, or at least Anheuser-Busch is imploding, because of this. They've seen weeks now of double-digit drops in sales. I mean, if it sounds like I'm taking pleasure in it, maybe there's a little bit of schadenfreude, but you shouldn't have been pushing it on people in the first place. Target now has pulled things off the shelves. Well, okay, well, we wanted to be inclusive, but you can be inclusive without forcing it on everybody or insisting that everybody participate. I don't know what to say about Ford. Henry Ford somewhere is going, man, what the heck happened? Why did things go so terribly wrong? By the way, I want to follow up on something I mentioned in the last episode about woke. I found what I think may be even a better definition. Woke means to be convincingly hoodwinked into realizing or believing that the structures or systems that produce and uphold American virtues are oppressive and that you have a divine moral obligation to engage in perpetual conflict with those virtues and American liberalism, they're talking classical liberalism, in order to liberate man and society and bring about social justice. That's a pretty encompassing definition. I don't disagree with any of it. So are you ready for some good news? Can I give you a little bit of good news? But understand, this won't be good news to everybody. Those within the media actually have a really hard time with this. But a couple of Supreme Court cases, a couple of rulings were handed down, rather, from the Supreme Court. One, and I don't remember in which state this was, but basically a municipality took an elderly woman's home for a very small property tax debt that she owed. Like, we're talking $100 or a few $100s. They took her home, sold it, and then kept all of the proceeds. I know horsewhipping should come back into fashion for people who would say with a straight face, well, those are the rules and that's the way it has to be done. That is not government operating within its proper role. And thankfully, the Supreme Court said you can't do that. So there's a little bit of a check on government power at that level. The second case was involving the EPA and the Clean Water Act and how it was used to keep an Idaho couple from developing their property at all. And let's start with the KTVB's take on this. Idaho reaction to Supreme Court ruling in Waters of the United States case. The ruling in a case that originated in Idaho limits how federal regulators can apply the Clean Water Act. Well, that couldn't be all bad news, could it? Well, KTVB apparently thinks it is. They said, a blow to environmental protections, a victory for private property rights. Those, in a nutshell, are the two contrasting reactions to the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling announced Thursday in Sackett versus EPA, a case that began in northern Idaho in 2004 when the Environmental Protection Agency threatened penalties of $40,000 a day against a couple getting ready to build a home on their property near Priest Lake. They weren't even on the lake, but just near it. By the way, it was a higher, I think it was $75,000 a day is what I heard from another source. Here's that master of contrived outrage, Senator Charles Schumer. This MAGA Supreme Court is continuing to erode our country's environmental laws. Make no mistake, this ruling will mean more polluted water, more destruction of wetlands. We'll keep fighting to protect our waters. Yes, because some bureaucrat who makes his home between New York City and Washington, D.C., with mansions in both places, is terribly threatened when a couple buys a couple of acres in Idaho and decides, yeah, we want to build our home on that. You can see how that would threaten our nation's waters and clean water everywhere. Senator Schumer, you are right to be outraged. Oh, boy. So take a little deeper dive here with a little bit of help from Brian Allman from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, a victory for property rights 15 years in the making. Brian, in writing about this case, points out that this morning, he's talking Thursday morning, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, overstepped its bounds when it tried to assert authority over the Priest Lake property of Michael and Chantel Sackett, rather. This Clean Water Act was initially passed in 1972 over President Nixon's veto. The act gave tremendous regulatory power to a cabal of unelected bureaucrats who crafted draconian rules and then handed down punishments without due process. That sounds like bureaucracy, all right. The EPA has used the provisions of this act to assert authority over the property owner's ability to develop their own land. And when they did this, they drug it out knowing that, hey, this family, the Sacketts, how are they going to have the resources to fight us in court if we make it last, over decades? Well, as the Idaho Freedom Foundation reported more than 10 years ago, the Sacketts sought a hearing with the EPA. They were summarily denied. The unelected bureaucrats charged with protecting the environment seemed to think they shouldn't be held accountable to the public. A district court upheld the decision, as did the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, but in 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that this couple had the right to challenge the EPA's ruling. Well, this was followed by 10 years of litigation, as the Sackett family argued that since their property had no connection to the navigable waters, the EPA had no jurisdiction. Then the EPA tried a dirty trick of rescinding their ruling and moving to dismiss the case, hoping the courts would not issue any binding judgments. The courts denied this motion, but in 2021, the Ninth Circuit once again ruled against the Sackett family, upholding the EPA's determination that since their property was near a lake, it was covered by the law. So the good news is, the Supreme Court said, no, that's way too much latitude. And it's about time. It really is about time that somebody reined in some of these out-of-control, unelected bureaucracies. Look, who has a more vested interest in making sure that the water is clean, that the land is not polluted or strip mined or otherwise destroyed? It's the people who actually live there. It's the people who make it their home. Why do we have to buy into this notion that some bureaucrat sitting back there along the Potomac somehow knows what's best and has to send out this army of regulators to make it happen? With virtually unlimited time and resources to tie things up legally, with no lawmaking ability, but the ability to create rules that are somehow enforced as if they were laws. I mean, tens of thousands of dollars a day if you don't do exactly as we say. This is a nice step in the right direction. And I hope it's something that is hopefully the beginning of a trend that we will see continuing on. I know that Chuck Schumer said, it's that MAG Supreme Court, but even if you're not a Donald Trump fan, you can be grateful that we did manage to get a few justices on board the Supreme Court who still believe that there are proper limits to government and who are willing to say that this needs to be the case. Most of the other problems, well, let's keep focusing on solving them as close to home as we possibly can. Have yourself a wonderful Memorial Day weekend, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.